greatness of humanity is not in being human, but in being humane. Gandhi. Before I begin, whether you like or hate Gotchard, for the show about fighting Malice, I implore you not to spread your own in the comments. Be civil, be respectful, and no slurs or hateful messages. Let's be as kind as the characters in Kamen Rider that aren't the villains. Kamen Rider has always been an interesting franchise. I had jumped in around Dragon Knight and Gaim, and outside of one series thanks to depression, it was always fascinating about the core concept of Kamen Riders. Powers either meant for, used by, or once in the control of evil, being used by flawed yet well-meaning people to combat the wicked sides of humanity. Fortunately, I can't really say the same about fandoms and communities. From what I've researched, Tokusatsu in general doesn't have the best reputation amongst the general public, with Power Rangers being used as a punching bag for people joking about bad fight scenes, despite the series having some really amazing choreography. But within Sentai and Rider, at least when it comes to Western fans, there seems to be this disposition that they're only good because they're darker and edgier, which is what prevails a bunch of discussions. So when I had learned about what Gotchard's themes were at the start of its announcement, I only jumped in to see the very mixed reception in the community, but now that it's over, I wanted to give a perspective I really haven't seen all that much people talk about, because it's been a prevailing theme I don't see many people bringing up. This show has Kamen Rider's strongest themes of humanity, not just our impact on each other, but in comparison to Zero One's themes on technology and our will versus how we use another as tools, Gotchard exclusively focuses on humanity and how we treat not just our human lives, but also the lives of those we create through both its humans and its chemis. Also, it was either that or ask Marcusatsu to be in the Gotchard discussion, which I would love to be a part of, but I don't think that's going to happen unless he sees this and I make a Discord, and it's already too late. Which I'd be happy to make, because Gotchard is one of the most interesting seasons to talk about. So let's get into the first arc. So one of the criticisms and praises for the show is that it feels like a regression or return of new ideas in Heisei Phase 2 for its detractors, but mix in Reiwa sensibilities amongst its likers. I definitely lean more towards the latter, but Hotaru Ichinose as a protagonist felt more like a Reiwa choice. And let me explain why. All of the past 4 Kamen Rider series have had one thing in common with each other. The main protagonists are all adults with their own careers. For the most part, they are mature, but the plot serves more as obstacles to their ideals and how they adapt with their supporting cast, and the blind spots in their motivations, which I do like to some degree. But Gotchard's unique because it's actually about the journey for Hotaru to eventually mature and develop into that character fitting of most of the Reiwa protagonists. Now, while I don't think the first episode was perfect, it sets a lot up for the story and what Hotaru is. A well-meaning, positive teen with all the heart but none of the brains and the uncertainty of his future aspirations. But his classmates don't respect him, Rene's the complete opposite of his personality, and Minato's in the middle as someone who wants to help him out but is also aware that his own immaturity is holding him back. And I can't wait to talk about Minato later, but that also leads into why I like the chemis as a gimmick. The chemis themselves, our sentient creatures, are what seem like a mixed bag, but having them be living beings was unique because essentially they were made with the sole intention to take advantage of people's malice, and most of the time it's against their will. They're essentially babies and child soldiers where both sides see them as a danger, but one sees them as tools and the other only sees them as monsters to be subjugated, which is what makes the hero side compelling. Because on one end, you have Hotaru, Sabimaru, and Fuga, who all see the chemis as living creatures, friends, allies, and people, and the chemis work with them or resonate with them despite the rest of humanity seeing otherwise. Then you have Rene, Renge, Minato, Kajiki, and Kyoka, who are in the middle. They see the chemis as dangerous, or they see alchemy and chemis as a mean for good things, but they still don't act upon the idea of working with them as a means to an end, but they still respect them. And finally, you have Spanner and the Association, who only see them as mindless threats that need to be subjugated and controlled. While Spanner slowly starts to accept their existence is not too dissimilar of his own, since he believes, like the Black Flames, powers that require evil shall eventually be eradicated and destroyed, the Association's steadfast conservatism and their own failings to get involved and do something ultimately end up being killed by a villain whose ideals of the chemis as threats lead to him showing off what someone's actually willing to do with them. So, going with the first arc, one thing I appreciated was the amalgams themselves. Because of the Dark Sisters, or their goals to use them in order to make dread, we got to avoid the monster of the week / victim of the week trope that focuses on a random side character, since it actually lets us focus on the main characters and the chemis, since most of the villains are either the generals, or some the actual criminals that Nick Jr. would never allow to air on TV. Like, we have a dude who kills his fellow gang members, a stalker we later find out kills their female victims, a psycho that was going to stab someone because of jealousy, a former alchemist that was going to murder Spanner out of spite, a dad that attempted to murder his son, and a wrestler that was targeting newer stars and screwing over the coach's efforts. Like, yikes, we really picked the worst examples of humanity to be perfect hosts for these creatures. Yes, we get some of the character interactions and dynamics that continued on from beginning to end. Going back to Hotaro, with either cast having their own ideals, it allows every member to be fleshed out just enough where you at least understand their motivations and their sensibilities. Using both his home life and his cooking, Hotaro is able to bond with Rinne and mostly have a friendship and healthy mentor-student rivalry as writer and alchemist despite being the same age. And as a secondary, normally this would come with the cliche that because of Fuga's death, Rinne would naturally be jealous of Hotaro for being chosen by him over her. But instead, she breaks down. She's an introvert, but she still cares for her father, despite believing he betrayed her and the lifestyle he helped build her up in. The difference here is that by episode 4, Hotaro uses that to help her through her problems, and it kickstarts her helping him become more mature and loosen up, while she becomes more expressive and starts to enjoy life again. And that continues throughout the first arc between the Wrestler G episode, where she sides with them against Spanner, teasing him in the Boruto episode, the Kyoto arc, where she generally starts to have fun while the throat post keeps gaslighting and manipulating her into becoming her ideal friend, by trying to get rid of everyone she cares about when Dread shows up. And everyone in the first arc gives Hotaro struggles to strive for. Spanner shows him that he has to put in effort to stop the amalgam chemies to get him to his side. He and Rinne have to work together in the cave. He has to train several times at Wrestler G to take on Gorilla. He needs Spanner's help to save Rinne. He has to actively understand the chemies to work and resolve on their issues with Sabo Needle. But it takes the Kyoto episode to make it stand out, because we get Amalgam host that's genuinely sympathetic in Hijiri, and the idea of chemies being used as ancient legends that end up connecting with people while also fleshing out Kajiki ends up really expanding on the world building in ways you wouldn't expect. This ends up elevating the Dread arc. The heroes get a challenge with Dread being able to defeat everyone, and since they can't get subjugated, it's Hotaro treating the chemies as living creatures, trying to communicate to them that allows him to come up with a way to defeat Dread without killing Sabimaru, which is something you wouldn't get in the first arc of a story outside of Build and maybe Revice. This feels like something that would be done in Precure, but it's interesting to see Kamen Rider take aspects from one of its sister series, even if it's not really that acknowledged amongst in the tokusatsu community. And that further expands on with X-Rex and how it starts to affect people going forward. Another family was impacted by the chemies that Hotaro reveals were positive, with the reveal he was actually being able to become friends with both Hopper 1 and Steamliner in the past. Rinne starts to question the gaslighting, and Tamami and Hotaro help her get the courage to stand up to her Thropos and start her goal to become a proper heroine. Spanner starts to end up feeling like he's getting surpassed as the Dark Sisters use Dread to almost self-destructive levels, but Hotaro refuses to let Clotho die of malice. The movie is a mixed bag for me. I do love the interactions in the first half, and Rinne eventually defeating Licht on her own after getting the courage to use his plan against him and secure her own driver. But the third arc of the movie really needed her involvement. There was a huge lack of Geet's characters that could have made this conflict more impactful, and while Licht's motivations are hilariously petty, it's a shame he gets arrested and never shows up again, and I will talk about that in a future video. Then we get to the third arc, which either is the best or the worst part of the series depending on who you ask. Grion was set up as early as episode 5, and Kyoke was sprinkled in the X arc, so their inclusion was well built up enough compared to how some people act like the show had some sort of retool. And how Grion impacts the plot somehow manages to make everyone else more interesting in the process. So let's talk about that. Through his actions, Grion's able to turn Hotaro's efforts against him by turning his fights into using the driver as fuel to open the gates of darkness technically Door of Darkness, while showing off him and Fuga's clash that led to Hotaro's path into alchemy, even if he didn't recognize it at the time. Rinne gets to finally transmute her own ideologies now that she knows the organization sold them out, so she has to reaffirm her own beliefs for a change. Spanner gets to confront his weakness and reveal that Grion murdered his parents and kickstarted the black flames that he relies on, only to realize that using that same malice isn't going to help him get stronger. All the while, Sabimaru and Renge are still continuing to help them out despite being outmatched. And having Kyoka and Minato's change boost this arc so much. Having the igniter be made from Gotchard and his support helping Spanner become a proper writer also ends up using Kyokyo well and how she humanizes Spanner and supports the cast when they lost their mentor. The fact that she knows the villains are trying to kill her to impact Spanner was just hilarious, but her adding the backstory between Fuga being on the run and Minato's motivations for turning evil flesh out the world and do a lot to explain why the association's inactions have cost them in the long run. But Minato's story was so tragic because as writing this, I was noticing the Markusatsu discussion and another video that came up, and I regret not making this video last week's, but I can't get into details on all of the circumstances, but a lot of people found Minato's face heel turn ridiculous, and I can't agree with that. Being a teacher requires a lot of boundaries and yet social bonds you have to prepare for. So learning the guilt he has for Guion murdering all his classmates and his attempts to train and motivate his students wasn't enough kind of leads into an actual problem that some teachers have to face. In real life, teachers have lost students before, especially in elementary and middle school. Around the time Gotchard was airing, a few students and their families lost their lives to a lack of mental health resulting in the deaths of multiple people, and the school couldn't handle it well. There were students who couldn't handle it that just did not come to school. Teachers had to leave because their hearts couldn't manage it, and when there was a vigil for the kids and their parents, people were breaking down left and right. We saw Minato struggle between helping, fleeing, and just needing escape from it all, only for Lachesis and Kyoka to talk some sense into him. It's not just a miscommunication trope. The trauma he could have let his own students to their deaths is completely understandable, and it makes his return to the heroes in the final battle of Arc 3 all the more worth it. Speaking of the third arc, I didn't even get to bring up how it affects the Dark Sisters. They were fine in the beginning, but I ended up liking them way more on because of how Guion split up them and their ideologies. Atropos becomes fiercely in denial about Guion manipulating and using them. Lachesis fully gets a taste of her own sadism and finds value in Spanner and Minato's humanity, to the point she fully turns good, and Cloto ends up in the middle trying to keep everyone together. And yet, the show doesn't forget about the chemis in the process. The Golden Amalgams replace the victims, so we get some of the epic fights like Fire's debut, Iron requiring Fuga and Hotaro using forbidden alchemy set up in episode 11 to use, so when all the cards get taken, the Zukyu Empires were fun, and we get Dread continuing to evolve until Hotaro is able to use his growth to encourage them to fight back against Guion and help Hopper 1 evolve and become Platinum to save the day. At the start of the third arc, everyone was fractured and divided, but they all came together by the end. The fourth arc is a little messy, but the theme of humanity overcoming malice continues a lot stronger. Renge finally gets to show off her backstory and is able to use the chemis without the riser, while Ninetales shows off a chemi and used as amalgam can actually end up as a means to help guide the heroes to help them out, which is something we knew was possible, but it was the first time we actually got to see that be explored. And while Renee's two-parter could have been handled better, she gets to show off why her growing bond with Hotaro is something she has to assert, since despite her jealousy, she ended up being the one to get a pep talk, overcome her doubts, and take on the ink monster in a very creative way. And then we get to the Legend arc. While I sympathize with the people who thought this was unnecessary, it still ended up being something enjoyable without needing to watch the Legend specials themselves. From Hotaro helping Cloto recognize her goal is to protect her sisters and start her becoming more empathetic, we get the first episode of the whole gang taking on 100, the speech where Hotaro talks about protecting all aspects of life, human or chemi, as he takes on all 26 chemis against Eternal Alphabet Bomb, which is a huge nod of respect to the series and the core of deals of Kamen Rider, to a bunch of fakes just using the suits without the motivations of their original intenders. We also get Lachesis saving Renee and Spanner, and while I have issues with the next two episodes and Lachesis' lack of involvement, Hotaro and Kaguya's relationship is much more authentic than the quote-unquote jangling keys I saw people claiming this arc was. Kaguya was a lone rider of his world torn up by evil and only has his butler. Him trying to appeal to Hotaro by using his chemis as a tool to stop the villains and show off respect only backfiring contrasts well with Hotaro's emotional growth being full on display, as it actually allows him to figure out Kaguya's intentions were in the right place with help from Butler. Though Kaguya decided to destroy the arc without his involvement, it's because Hotaro wants to show him the impact of not being alone against evil does Kaguya start to solidify the heart of a Kamen Rider. And then we get to Hopper 1's death. Granted, I had a feeling this was going to happen, but when it was revealed Gigas made the chemis and could kill their spirits, watching them essentially kill off their protagonist's partner to save an innocent life, and Hotaro gets confronted with Nijigon, giving him the option to just give up for working so hard, it really hits when Hotaro reflects upon his mom using cooking to cheer him up, and that encourages both himself and Gon to break out of their shells, which culminated into one of the best final forms we've had for a while. Combating malice through inaction has continuously shown to be a bad thing. Renee hurt herself hiding away her feelings. Spanner's memory wipes never allowed him to try and open up his heart since his powers could go rampant. The alchemists continued to screw over the main cast, but Hotaro and Gon were able to find another way, make a change, and break out of their own inaction. In essence, you could say that the shell was basically a reflection of their choice. If they continued to stay in the shell, they would be okay, but the rest of the world would fall to Malice. But if they broke out, there's still a chance that they might get infected by said Malice, but they'll at least be able to stand on their own with their own willpower before that happens. And using cooking as a means for Hotaro to finally understand the aspects of alchemy and being able to incorporate it himself in battle for the first time finally felt like an arc that came full circle. Having Gigas' understandable pseudo-empathy in contrast with Germain and Galgia's being twisted versions of love and fate turned on their head to manipulate humanity's alchemy and their malice to revive the amalgams of Arc 1, leading to Gion returning to get revenge on the same people who created him and rise to power, kind of made this a great final challenge for all of the heroes. Though I wish Germain lasted longer, his twisted love contrasting the heroes all came together to jump him, and his lack of empathy for essentially eating his own child comes back to bite him when Atropos uses her father's humanity to transmute him back into Grion. It was perfect karma, and I kind of wish We Are Girls was used as an insert theme for moments with Rinne and any of the other girls. We get Sabimaru finally concluding his trauma with defeating Dread and the extra amalgam between him and his brother. It would have been too early to introduce this when Dread wasn't a thing in Arc 1, and while I think this would have fit in Arc 4 over Arc 5, since Grion returned and he's the impetus behind Dread, I get the rationale for this as Sabimaru actually gets some closure. It is really refreshing that Kamen Rider had Sabimaru and Renge be those two guys that seemingly don't do much of anything in the series, but instead of killing them off or giving them nothing to do, they actually get to do their jobs as supportive characters who help out throughout the entire show, even in the finale, which I will get to. Kajiki also gets to confront Hijiri's own malice that was setting in her the whole time, not by abandoning it, but through everyone else reaching out to her and going from someone in love with the paranormal to using his love for the paranormal to save someone who felt like she couldn't reach out to the person who mattered the most for her. And I like how even though she doesn't reach out her brother for now, in the end, her and Kajiki are going to work together to eventually see if she could reach him, which I respect. Then we get Spanner and Hotaro finally going head-to-head with their ideals, in that both of them believe that they are right, but also have flaws in their logic. Hotaro sees the hard way that humanity's malice and apathy are going to make his goals much harder, and even if the threat goes away, there will always be people who won't accept them. But even he won't let them become abused. Meanwhile, Spanner's hero complex that was built up for a while, leading him to try and finally take him and the Chemis out, makes a lot of sense. Like the Chemis, he also saw himself as a danger to people that had to be taught and learn to control his powers, but we do see him regretting hurting the ones who followed him. This wasn't Spanner turning evil, since the guy was trying to fight the Dark Kings, would obviously try to do so in the way he felt was appropriate to his ideals. But because he sees himself as a hero willing to die to save the world, he's not thinking that he doesn't have to kill himself to overcome malice, because there are going to be people worth living who would potentially fall into malice if he died, like Kyoka. But you know who does recognize that? Rinne. For the majority of the series, Rinne went from someone needing to pick herself up into someone who throughout the story reaching for Atropos while she was continuing to support her father, and he was doing a good job convincing people his actions were genuine, promising mercy to Lacus via Cloto's regret, the situation with Mami, and recollecting on his relationship with Fuga before backstabbing his own daughter. After everyone warned her for over a year, it is both satisfying and sad for Atropos to recognize that, save for Rinne, and ultimately work with her origin to become Twilight Majade and defy the Galgia, who let herself become overrun with malice to become a monster, while Atropos finally recognized the worth in Rinne's humanity. I wish we had more time to explore the Dark Kings originally being humans, but either way, this still ended up being a really strong conclusion to Rinne's arc for the series, in that eventually she managed to reach out to the one person, even though they kept rejecting her time and time again. It does show that in situations when it comes to gaslighting and abuse, being the right support system that you need for someone will ultimately pay off. It just might take a while for some people more than others, which, in the end, you could just argue is just as human as anything else. And in contrast, we finally get to see Spanner and Lacus' relationship improve to the point he's a lot more open with her and stops calling her a doll. But Gigas finally does something again and targets her. I don't like that all the girls don't get to transform or do much, but Spanner finally comes to terms with his powers not being evil and evolving his black flames into silver after realizing Hotaro, Lacus, and Kyoka were able to heal his heart, finally admitting his respect for his rival and defeating Gigas. In a pretty cool rider kick. Oh, as for the anti-Chemi sentiment, yeah, it's actually more realistic when you put a little bit of thought into it. How many times have people let misinformation, public opinion based on rumors, and fake news outrage farms lead people to act against their best interests? I don't like how they're able to break into the Alchemist Union, but Tachan being used as X from the Zuku Empire arc, and the guy who screwed over the Sawa and Yuzuru family, so bringing him back was at least understandable to have as a hate sink. So I watched the finale a few days ago, and while I don't agree it was rushed, we still never found out who Hotaro's dad was or how he ended up in Ouroboros realm. They're probably going to save that for the crossover film or V cinema, but in a weird sense, I'm actually okay with that. Rather than focusing on someone who abandoned Hotaro, he's got his mom's blessing, who's been like an MVP this whole arc. His allies are able to beat the Dark Kings while he goes on to fight Greyon, and I do like a lot about the final battle. For starters, while she was technically holding the heroes off, Kloto goes out as a fighter and encourages her rival. I wish their rivalry was more profound throughout the series, but Athorpos finally commending her in the afterlife for doing well, as they grabbed her hands in the afterlife, was just a fitting end to her character arc, even though I wish the fight could have been a little bit better. Even Renge, Sabimaru, and Kajiki ended up helping the civilians. I'm really glad this show allowed the heroes to have allies who can help them out in a battle without becoming Kamen Riders. The final battle itself was pretty good. I did check online to see a lot of people were upset with their protagonist making his own driver to be an updated version of his base suit, but it didn't bother me. From what I heard, Soryo gave Aruto his in 01, while Luna gave her life to make the Wonder Almighty book. This is the first time this trope is handled with the protagonist having their own agency, using the goal that was meant to restrain him and turning it into his own driver. So Hotaro already having a ton of alchemic energy and power inside of him thanks to Nijigon and the Gotchard driver kind of was already established. So essentially using what he learned from using it properly as Rainbow Gotchard as a human to remake his driver and fight alongside the other writers was perfect, and it gave him more agency than the other two, even if I agree that the points behind those two shows fit their theme of what they were going for. As for him transmuting Grion's gold into his own parallel Earth, I saw people saying that this went against the themes of the show. The reason why I don't agree is because this shows Hotaro has matured. He knows he can't force humanity to accept chemis because their combined malice is too much for them to bear, but he is aware that there are people who are proof that slowly but surely people will come to accept them. In essence, he knows it'll take a long time for Earth to get used to them for now, so he'll make his own world for chemis and humans to get along. He's always had unorthodox methods to solve problems, but this fully completed that cycle that was early present from episode 2. And I appreciate Hotaro defeating Greyon, resulting in Greyon finally being impressed with someone else's chemistry. Last time they fought, Hotaro needed the chemis back then to defeat him, but this time he's got every single chemi alongside him to finish him off, and this time he's doing it in his base form that he made with everyone else, supporting all the efforts he made for him in order to defeat the guy who only saw them as tools in the end for his own dream. The ending was alright for the most part. Renee and Spanner are presumed to go and find a way to resurrect Lachesis and Athorpos, which I'm fine with. Renee and Hotaro hold hands to explore the chemis. I do kind of wish when it comes to romance, Kamen Rider would just be straight open, but we did get enough hints at it that there is some sort of romantic tension, and I support it. And we also enough with Kaguya and Gotchard introducing Shoma. So I was listening to a few more reviews, one mixed, one negative, which was just filled with I hate this and that, and a Marco Sasha discussion, where even two people who disagreed were able to be respectful. I don't like fandoms anymore, I mostly stick to what interests me, hence the name of the channel, but I ended up understanding and resonating with a lot of Gotchard themes, and even though they disagreed back and forth, they understood each other and able to respect each other. And with some of Gotchard's themes, how the old generation can help and undermine the younger generation. The next generation are a bunch of doomers, but people who need the right experiences to mature and develop. The importance of creativity and accepting yourself, and why apathy and being inactive to your own problems is just as bad as giving into malice and hatred. But through living creatures, humans, alchemists, anyone working together, humanity can overcome malice. Even if the effects are in the long term, we can still improve our lives to the better. Thank you for listening, and for a series all about combating malice, I ask you not to spread your own in the comment section below. And thank you for listening.